Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. Also, if you haven't bought Reconstructing Inclusion, Making DEI Accessible, Actionable, and Sustainable, my book, please pick it up. We also have a Substack now under the name Reconstructing Inclusion. I'll be putting more content on that Substack before you know it. Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. This is Amri Johnson, your host, and it's going to be just me today. I want to talk about a couple things. One, I want to talk about where DEI is, where DEI has an opportunity. And two, I want to talk about a little bit about how DEI has sometimes caused what Ivan Illich says, iatrogenic effects in organizations and in society. I'll talk more about what that means in a second. So first, where DEI is, I've written before, and those of you that follow me on other platforms, I talk a lot about the belief that DEI is under attack, that DEI is at risk, that they are coming to get DEI because they've heard some silly, I would say, billionaires say certain things about the work. There's a few organizations who are organizing to push things back. Some ceasing of the DEI conversation is happening in some states, in state government, possibly could happen in the federal government. It has, at least to an extent, before. The question becomes, what is DEI? And what is DEI to the people that make these rules? And what I've seen mostly is they're pushing back against preferences for hiring similar to how the affirmative action law was abolished by the Supreme Court last year. So that's not DEI, is representation and affirmative positive action. That's a part of some of its history is steeped in that. But if that's the modern, the contemporary frame for DEI that we have as practitioners, I don't know if we've done our job adequately, particularly when we immediately react to some of these claims, not with real clarification about DEI and how I define inclusion, for example, as creating the conditions for everybody to thrive and for your organization to create value beyond just their P&L. If we have a conversation like that, we move not into DEI as an ideological construct, which a lot of these people are striking back against, which has some, I guess it should say, credence, because some of the things that have been done haven't been helpful. And I'm going to talk about that in a second when I talk about DEI and iatrogenesis, or there are iatrogenic effects. But if somebody's coming at you about this ideological space, you can really go be very clear about what does it mean to manage tension and complexity in organizational life? What does it mean to create the conditions for people to thrive and make contributions to those that, you're putting an investment in at risk? So if you're contributing to young people and internships and mentoring as a program you have and things like that, that could potentially yield you one or two amazing people that have developed some familiarity with your firm over time and can step in and make some things happen from a perspective of their life's journey and their experiential journey that you couldn't get if you hadn't put that investment in. And of course, inclusion is any action that creates the conditions for people to thrive and for your organization to create immense value. So if people want to argue down the DEI is dead and something's wrong, DEI is causing the opposite effect, and whatever somebody might say that's uninformed, you as practitioner, those of us passionate about the work, have to be very deliberate in saying, yeah, that's one perspective, not reacting, not getting mad and saying they're going to do this and they're going to do that. The sky is falling, Chicken Little, not putting reason into practice, not using your eye for seeing what's getting in our way as those putting this into practice and creating the conditions for more and more people in organizations to do the same, what it says to me is this attack is one of the biggest opportunities in this space, maybe in the history of knowing it as a thing, and back to diversity management, a la Dr. Roosevelt Thomas and others who were pioneers. There's a space, an opportunity for us to go to the next level. So don't look at this as an attack. Look at this a bit as a privilege, because if you're getting some pressure, as Doc Rivers says, pressure is a privilege, and we need to take full responsibility with this conversation and move it where we want it to be moved rather than on our heels trying to react to something somebody else is saying. Be very squared up, being like, all right, well, here's where we see this work. Here's the transformational possibility, not, hey, I'm just reacting to these people that don't know a smidgen of what I know about this work. But if somehow you doubt that you do know that, you do have that depth, that also is a mirror for us to say, all right, we got to step it up. We got to put in more reading. We got to be more rigorous. We got to look at more disconfirmatory evidence. We got to do all those things. So that brings me to this conversation about iatrogenic effects. So iatrogenesis, or the notion of iatrogenics, came from a gentleman named Ivan Illich. Illich was a Roman Catholic priest. He was born to a mother who was born as a Sephardic Jew, and she converted to Christianity. And his father was Croatian and was Roman Catholic. So he became a Roman Catholic priest. And then he went on to get his further study and his doctorate in kind of a combination of theology and philosophy in 1951 at the University of Salzburg. He actually went to the Collegium Romanum, the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He did not go to the University of Salzburg, but he became faculty at the University of Salzburg later. So I'm reading, this is coming from Wikipedia. Illich was a polyglot and a polymath. And so he studied many things. He had pretty serious critiques for education in the United States. He had critiques for the production industrial capitalist society and what it meant to humanity. And in particular, the one that jumped out at me was his work related to medicine. And so he wrote a book called Medical Nemesis. And in that book, he talks about iatrogenesis or iatrogenic effects. In short, what iatrogenic effects are when a medical professional, particularly a physician, gives a treatment. It could be a medicine, it can be any other type of treatment, it could be surgery. And the result is that the organism is not better, but actually worse. So, in a way, the physician becomes the pathogen, or the professional becomes the pathogen. Now, this is a natural kind of result of medicine. If you're doing multiple repetitions of something, something misses because of human fallibility or human imperfection. So these things happen. And there are some times where it's become institutionalized that these things have to be, or you have to act a certain way. And the one particular, there were different parts of iatrogenesis. There's the clinical iatrogenesis, which you can imagine is kind of direct. Patient was prescribed something, it didn't help them, it harmed them. That was clinical iatrogenesis. The social iatrogenesis, as he talked about, was more of how certain things are, people are socialized to behave and think a certain way in society. So Illich defines social iatrogenesis as it happens when what he calls medical bureaucracy creates poor health by increasing stress on people, multiplying dependence on organizations or institutions or on the medical profession itself, generating things that make people think they need certain things, lowering one's tolerance or discomfort from pain, and by reducing what I'm quoting this, the leeway that people are wont to concede to an individual when he suffers, and by abolishing even the right to self-care. So sometimes when people might go to a healthcare professional and they want to treat themselves, the socialized or social iatrogenesis says, no, you can't do that. You must do it our way. No, you can't do that. You must do it in a particular way because you'll have this or you'll have that. So these are the things that we say you must do, and you, in a way, socially have to adhere to them. So that's the notion of social iatrogenesis. Cultural iatrogenesis, for which Illich says is the real evil of iatrogenesis. It's the worst of the three. Cultural iatrogenesis is such that when somebody is ill, cultural iatrogenesis takes away one's agency. And so it takes away people's will to deal with their particular realities. It takes people's will away from thinking that they can care for themselves. Now, he's not saying that there isn't a need for medical intervention, but when everything is culturally telling you you have to go to this or that clinician to get your treatment, then that's a cultural way of taking away people's agency and making a dependence upon the medical professions rather than giving people the understanding that they can create the conditions for themselves. Now, you might see where I'm going with this now is in the DEI space as practitioners. We're not physicians, but we can sometimes be quite prescriptive. And in being prescriptive, we might be giving an organization and its people something that they could only get from us, which obviously, some of that you're like, yeah, this is what I do. You have to get it from me because that's my purpose. I'm an engineer, and therefore I do engineering, and I don't want to tell you how to do engineering. It's way too complex, and I'm good at it. So you can just call on me. In certain professions like engineering, absolutely. But when you're dealing with the complexities and tensions of similarities and difference in organizational life, you can't predict that like an engineer can predict what's going to happen when they install something either in software or hardware. You can troubleshoot that through almost protocol. You can't do that with humans. You can't do it with organizational complexity and all the things that are going to influence a business. You can't do it like that. So if you're prescribing something, if you're making a prescription for what DEI is and can be in organizational life, rather than finding out, discovering with the people, what actions do you need to take to create the conditions for everybody to thrive and for the organization to be generative? And if you're not doing that, you're making a lot of assumptions that probably will get in the way of progress and oftentimes leave you vulnerable for people to come in and say silly stuff because they might not have agreed with that versus, hey, let's create what this organization needs right now and call that, if we do it well in the sphere of creating the conditions for people, it's going to deal with the tensions and complexities of difference and similarity. It's going to create thriving, and it's going to allow you to build those capabilities to sustain it. Because if I come in as a consultant, which I'm always happy to do, but I'm not going there to make people dependent on me. I'm actually going there to help them create those conditions. That doesn't happen overnight, but it happens a lot faster if you're intentional about it and you start seeing the capacity go up for people. That's what gets me excited more than anything else in this work is, can we do that consistently? So back to iatrogenesis, particularly cultural iatrogenesis. And what this made me think about was that sometimes we do things, and most of the time unintentionally, we have these, what I consider forms of iatrogenesis and DEI. Not everybody's going to agree with this, but these are things that I believe can harm more than help. So there's no order to this, but the first one is exclusivity. When we're not broadening our lens to create more contact and really fortify the mix of similarities and differences in organizational life, we're missing the mark. And if we create exclusivity, what we do in effect is reduce people down to a particular part of their phenotype, a particular attribute of them. And so we always talk about intersectionality, but we then create exclusivity. We can create exclusivity in a job description. I saw the other day that some job was just asking for just Black people. And I was like, I think that's a categorical error. It's not smart to do that. It's the same thing that the so-called silly billionaires are saying about DEI is being racist. Reducing that down to a single identity is ridiculous. Now, I'm not saying that you don't want to recruit people that are from that particular identity. Exactly what you should be doing is casting the net wide. But to reduce it down, you might as well put in the main one that we go to, the straight white guy. We'd like a straight white guy. Nobody would ever do that. But as soon as you put a Black person in there, what's the difference other than the one's more represented than the other? But you're not going to get what you need and create the right conditions by that. So exclusivity doesn't work. Single identity ERGs are another space. I talk about this in Reconstructing Inclusion, where I don't really believe in them because I think they create caucuses, which again are not bad. But if you have a caucus and you don't have a caucus that's in contact with other caucuses with intention and with people that don't necessarily hold the same identity as the majority of people, if you don't mix people up, how do you actually get learning to work? So I say that these ERGs should not be closed by identity. I think they should be about contact. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, to things that we can do that are helpful, that don't create iatrogenesis in my experience. This goes into exclusivity of race or gender only development programs. I think I understand, I've seen them, I've done them. And in retrospect, I think we often miss the mark when we do it. We can caucus at times, but we should be prioritizing contact. So if we're caucusing more than we're in contact with the so-called other, with those who are coming from a different perspective, background, experience than us, then we don't necessarily create the right conditions for the long haul. I would say another form of iatrogenesis is most DEI training. And when I say training, it means you're trying to get somebody to do something or do something in a particular way or create more awareness. And including unconscious bias, the evidence is telling us that it's not getting us to where we want to be. And sometimes it can actually be more harmful than good. Now, there are times where there's going to be great DEI trainers, great unconscious bias educators. I felt like I was a decent one in my career so far. And that kind of education is part of a spectrum. We all know we're not doing one-off events, but for some people, the topics seem like the same topic, and they don't seem like or understand or have been given the opportunity to learn a variety of different things that complement what we would consider traditional DEI training. How do you work through tension and complexity of difference and similarity? We're often talking about that just in terms of the physical identity that we can see, and to some extent, we do it around sexual orientation, and we do it around disability, even those that you can't see. But we aren't really doing it in a way that's starting with our social identities in all of their breadth and depth. And if we did that, I think we'd have less iatrogenesis in the space. So those are a few things that I think are important. I'll just give you an example of iatrogenesis that I had medically some when I was in my 20s. I was having problems with my feet. I'd had problems with my feet since I was relatively young. There's probably quite a few reasons for that, but my feet were hurting all the time. I was having to go and get work done on them regularly at the podiatrist. And so the podiatrist in Atlanta when I was in college told me to have surgery and have surgery on both my feet at the same time. So I did it. It was a mistake. And it wasn't just a mistake because the surgeon, the junior surgeon, had made some mistakes that caused some problems with my foot and toe and et cetera. That was one issue. The other issue was I couldn't get around, and I think it was more difficult for me to heal the feet properly. And I've had some challenges with them ever since. Now, I've done things to strengthen my feet. I've had another surgery on one of my feet, which did help more than it harmed. But if I look back, if I would have had the agency, if I would have known what I know now about feet care and how I could have changed the nature of my feet over time naturally, which I now believe is possible, maybe having that guidance would have allowed me to take care of it in a way that I could sustain myself. So I'm going back to, if we want to create the conditions, actually making people dependent on you as a practitioner to an extent that you're not really a partner advisor, you're somebody that they count on, or you're internal and everybody comes to you for everything DEI or DEIA, DEIB, JEDI, whatever it might be. Everybody looks to you as this expert and they're not developing the capacity themselves. I would argue that that, in a way, is iatrogenesis. I wish that maybe this doctor didn't have that capability to do that. And that's why you have to be really mindful about who is really kind of one of the arbiters or the vectors of the work of DEI in your organization, because they need to have a certain amount of depth so they can give you a variety of things to think about and options to have that allow you to do this better and better and better yourself as a part of the organization that that person is working with. But even if you leave, you take those capabilities wherever you go. And so you can make contributions to the organization. A lot of people jump organizations and they're really passionate about diversity and they even step into a role, but did they have the depth to help guide the organization, to be in community with the organization, in dialogue with the organization, to be able to give some insight, some, for lack of a better word, instruction that people can take and do with what they need to do with to create the conditions for people to thrive and for the organizational mission to be fulfilled to its utmost, including and beyond the P&L. That's that. One other thing that can be iatrogenic, and I'm not saying in this in any order, is microaggressions. And oftentimes microaggressions are framed as subtle slights and insults that are directed toward minorities. I read a recent article on microaggressions. It's actually not recent. It came out in 2017. I read it and then I recently reread it, is what I was saying. So it was by Scott Lilienfeld. Dr. Lilienfeld passed away a few years ago, but he was it made a huge impact on the psychology field and in a lot of different ways. And so I suggest this paper, and if you're interested, I'm happy to share it. But the article was called Microaggression, Strong Claims, Inadequate Evidence. So I heard about micro inequities from Mary Rowe. So Mary Rowe, where I first encountered the idea of micro inequities, I think I read about that in the early 2000s. It might have been like oh 04. Yeah, it might have been oh 04, oh 05, as I was really formally getting into the corporate DEI space when I was working with Howard Ross at Cook Ross and Leslie Traub and many others. So I read that article and I was like, okay, this makes sense. These things happen. Now, I also said, you know what? It kind of depends on where people are in their perception of these things. But what I liked about what Dr. Rowe said, Dr. Rowe is an MIT professor. I think she's still living. She's a professor emeritus there now. So Dr. Rowe talked about these small, subtle things that oftentimes don't necessarily penetrate you consciously. And so to me, micro inequities made sense. They happen. The research behind them wasn't super strong yet, but we could probably say if we did surveys of multiple people, regardless of whether they're racialized or are non-male or any of that, probably most of us have experienced some semblance of it, and the impact and on us will differ based on how we perceive things like that. And obviously, when something gets in your subconscious mind, you don't necessarily know until something else gives you some type of pointer towards it. And so when I read that, it totally made sense. As the work of microaggressions evolved, I always had this uneasy feeling. And when I first went about reading Dr. Lilienfeld's paper, he made it clear to me that there are some things about microaggressions that need to be checked. It doesn't mean that we should completely abandon them, but we need to be more rigorous in them. Or it can be about just, making people wrong or saying something and all of it can ruin your career because it was a microaggression, or over policing language in organizations because you're worried about hurting somebody's feelings instead of actually things happening and then dealing with them. But the way sometimes people are now, their experience says we can be completely reactive to that. We don't have to go into meaning and making sense with each other. We can just accuse and fully stop. And the perpetuation of framing so-called microaggressions like that, I think it's problematic, right? There's a lot of other things that I think are problematic, and iatrogenesis covers a lot of them, even the way we're starting to medicalize DEI in ways that we didn't before. We're talking more about trauma. We changed the imposter phenomena to imposter syndrome. So, like, all of these things that we've done in the DEI space, I think they haven't always been helpful to us. They've been iatrogenic, but we haven't always been totally open to see where those iatrogenic effects happen and what we can do about them. So, what do I think helps in this whole area when we're trying to mitigate the impacts, particularly of cultural iatrogenesis, where there is this in cultural iatrogenesis where there's a certain way you have to do this and you don't have any agency of it. Like, you know, systemic racism is the problem and that's it, full stop. That level of feeling like victimization and, in a way, grievance as the main kind of vehicles of any kind of social reckoning or justice is simply not helpful. And in my opinion, it's harmful, is if that's the anchor. Now, obviously, there's been some horrendous things have happened in the history of many countries where many people have been enslaved, and in some places where it's illegally happening still. These horrible things happen. Some things that happen in our daily experience feel pretty bad, but being a victim of it, being of the feeling that you can't escape it because of your racialization, I don't think it's helping us that are racialized as much as we talk about it. So the idea is understand the history, understand the dynamics. But when you start talking about it too much, as I've said before, there's trade-offs to that. And what are those trade-offs? In my opinion, it takes people away from agency. Now, agency doesn't mean I'm doing this on my own, doesn't mean individualism, for those of you that might have the distinction of individualism, communalism, or collectivism. That this is not what agency means. Agency doesn't mean you're on your own. Agency, by its nature, means that you have some interdependencies, but you, as an individual, have the sense that you can take on whatever comes up, and you have others that can contribute to you as well. So, what can we do to move away from iatrogenic harms in the DEI space? One, we have to acknowledge that they're happening. That's probably the hardest piece. We have to understand and go deeper into looking at what microaggressions are, for example. We have to go deeper into to looking at our exclusivity in the space. We have to go deeper in reflecting on whether what we're doing in the anti-racist social justice space, in the support of women, support of LGBTQ plus, and how we're doing that is not potentially creating more harm than good, in the sense that it makes people feel like they're kind of perpetual victims in a quantum way, that they were victims in the past, victims in the present, and victims in the future, where you go back and forth in time being oppressed, where quite honestly, relative to even my dad's generation, who was a part of the integration of public schools in Topeka, Kansas, which has its 70th anniversary in May 17th. He was there then, and he ran business in that town. What I'm experiencing in my life and career in terms of discrimination, it's night and day. And if we can't be honest about that, it's going to be hard for us to be honest about anything. And it's going to be hard for us to perpetuate, move this work forward the way I think we can. When I say we, I mean everybody. And I don't necessarily mean that you agree with me. It doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be on the same page in terms of making this work. But that lack of really clear, honest reflection about where we are and what we can do, what we're doing, what we're not doing, what's getting in the way. If we're not really clear about that, it's going to be hard to progress. It's going to be hard for us to kind of laugh off and be able to articulate how silly some of these people that are so-called going after DEI are. We won't be able to do that if we're always on our heels and we're not being reflective about where we are, what we're creating, what might be getting in the way of what we want to create. Now, the helps. I've got to get back to the helps. What helps? So it helps being completely clear, honest, transparent. It helps when we look for disconfirmation. And I talk about this a lot. I'm going to talk about it more. Are we looking for disconfirming evidence? I think it was Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff that used this term institutionalized disconfirmation, where you are looking to be less wrong by looking for what might be challenging, problematic, or off the mark with your held assumptions about things. And in DEI, do we challenge our held assumptions or do we stand on them so tough that we don't get a chance to make corrections so that we can be less wrong and get better every day in this work? That's what I love about athletic teams, regardless of the sport. There's times where y'all like, man, we got to be honest about where we are. First, how honest am I about my level of contribution? And if I'm not at my same level of contribution, maybe I need to take a different role. That's the honesty I think about sports because everybody has a common goal. They come together with all their strengths and differences and similarities. And they have support of this team and this coach, and they keep working at it day in and day out. That's what it's all about. It's very similar also to intergroup contact theory. I'm not going to go into depth around that, but I might mention a little bit more. So be clear, be able to find disconfirmation, and then connote and talk about agency. And I'm not talking about lone wolves and individual players and individualism. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about pure, true agency where people have this ability to take it upon themselves, to take it upon the communities they are a part of, and be able to take it into how they interact and work and complement and be complement by others. So this idea of agency is not a solo one, but you do need to start with self and feeling like you're confident to be able to make these connections, to know that you're confident in your field, to know that you can grow, and to know that you have people that are there to help you get there. That's what I mean by connoting agency. If we do that and we connote agency with DEI, the transformational potential, in my opinion, advances rather than no, depend on the institution or depend on your boss or depend on the organization that you're a part of to do everything versus creating the capabilities that if something happened and didn't go right, you could pivot and go someplace else and be good. Or there's people there that you've developed enough social capital with to be like, hey, look, here is where I'm seeing things. Here's where I'd like to go. Can we talk about how to fill in that gap? Again, that's called creating the conditions for people to thrive. It helps the organization, obviously, in a natural way. So now I've talked about being very clear about where we're getting things right and wrong, what we need to do, check ourselves before we wreck ourselves, looking in the mirror and just making sure we're clear, maybe putting into place something like institutional disconfirmation. And the next one is connoting agency. When we do this DEI work, the agency is a big part of what we're trying to do for people as they develop capabilities that help them and help others create the conditions for people to thrive and for your organization to create immense value. So, along with those, the next one is intentional broadening versus exclusivity. Are we broadening the lens? And when I talk about broadening, I'm talking about opening up and being intentional about connecting people inside of networks, inside of your organization, external to your organization. What helps them with certain connections versus exclusive kind of packs? And I can say that based on single identity of race or gender. But I'm talking about all types of exclusivity by seniority, by who sits at what lunch table, when, where, reducing that. If you want to create the conditions for people to thrive, be very broad about making connections with people because it's hard sometimes for people to come together because they have their own group that they interact with in organizational life, usually because of what they do every day. So be intentional about broadening people's lens, broadening people's circles, so that they can make connections that are unusual, that usually yield a different type of question about what the organization needs to be up to or create, given the opportunity of some synergies across groups of people that might not be intentionally broadening, that might be more caucus like. And so that this kind of dovetails into the other thing, along with intentional broadening, is moving away from exclusivity requires more contact versus caucus. And I talked a little bit about just a second ago about intergroup contact theory. And that was the science that was behind Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, where the scientist Gordon Allport had some really well established data that said when you bring people together as equals, and I say like under the Constitution or under the laws of the Creator, when you bring them together with equality, when you bring them together to do something that both of them are committed to, that both of them find extreme value in, that they want to pursue together, you give them time to interact, and you have some type of institutional support, you create greater contact. Greater contact mitigates prejudice. It mitigates the tendency for racialization in a way that's not helpful. So intentional broadening can include contact being greater than caucus. That's the opportunity. So we've talked about iatrogenic effects, how you reduce them. We've talked about it in terms of mitigating exclusivity, contact over caucus. We talked about making agency align with DEI. We talked about holding up the mirror on ourselves and making sure that we know where we've been causing the matter of the breakdown, and as well as thinking about how we can transcend it and get better. And then, of course, institutional disconfirmation. So those are the things that I think can combat some of the iatrogenic ways of being. So rather than focus, for example, on microaggressions in the way that they're often framed now, perhaps we think about micro affirmations more, starting with the work of Mary Rowe and micro inequities. And then she moved on to talking about micro affirmations, and several other researchers have as well. How can we do better about using that as our lead? Like, how can we mitigate the potential dysfunctional impact of what we call microaggressions by having enough social capital to make that stronger? So these are things that, for example, we can do as practitioners to hold up the mirror and go deeper so that we do things that don't create iatrogenic effects unintentionally. So that's all I have today. Iatrogenesis is happening in the DEI space. If we want to be able to push back on some of the rhetoric that's coming at DEI practitioners and programs and states, we need to be very clear about where we're doing the work in a way that is creating the conditions for thriving, in ways that we are creating iatrogenic effects, oftentimes unbeknownst to us, because we haven't held up the mirror, at least not long enough, to see what's getting in the way. I believe this work, and I've said it and I'll say it again, has great potential. I believe we're just scratching the surface. I believe that what's coming now is giving us the fuel to do something more extraordinary, because a lot of organizations are continuing to work at this, and as they should with any other strategic function in the organization, they should be constantly elevating their game. So DEI is not dead. DEI is not going anywhere. It's that we as practitioners, that those that are passionate, those that support this work, I imagine all of you that are listening to this podcast, we all have to get better. We all have to be skilled operators of your inclusion system, of the inclusion system in your organization. And I believe that we can all do that. We can do it together as we keep learning. So I hope that was helpful. Make it a great day. Make sure to read Reconstructing Inclusion if you haven't. Always more to come. We appreciate you. Make it a great day. Peace. If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.